Welcome everybody to WriteHive 2026. So excited to have everybody here. I love this time of year, and this is my 5th year participating in the WriteHive annual conference. So it is always an amazing time. For those of you joining us live or maybe later on a recording, thank you so much for supporting WriteHive. If you don't know what WriteHive is a nonprofit organization, and they are here to always provide lots of free resources and community for all things indie. So anything that you can possibly think of, lots of mentoring groups, writing opportunities, definitely conferences. We have our full conference here. We have silent auctions throughout the year. So an amazing group of volunteers that is just dedicated to getting the stories out there that need to be heard and writing the future that we need. So we are all here today for A Few Strange Things, the World of an Unreliable Narrator panel. I've got 4 amazing panelists with me, and then one might actually join. So we've got some amazing panelists here with us today, and I'm going to let them kind of introduce themselves. I'm going to kick it off, kind of going clockwise on my screen. Livia, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Livia J. Elliot. I'm an author. I'm a podcaster. So I am publishing 2 series, which I always describe as weird lit. They are both genre blenders. And I also have my award-nominated podcast, Books Undone, which is also on Substack. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Livia. We're so excited to have you. All right. Heading right down to my screen. Anne.
Hi, everyone. I go by Ange, but my author name is A.M. Shilling. I'm really grateful to be here with this opportunity with WriteHive, and I am a horror, fantasy, and romance author. My debut, The Devouring, came out in April this year, and I specialize in morally questionable people, their terrible circumstances, and how they manage to love each other despite it all.
Gotta love our morally questionable characters there. Awesome. Thanks so much, Ange. So glad to have you here. Moving right along. Ash?
Hi, I'm Ash. I write under Ashley N.Y. Sheesley. I'm a Arrow Ace and disabled author, scientist, animal lover, big fan of all things fantasy. I have a short story in Artifice and Access, a disability and fantasy anthology, and I get to be in the part 2 to that series coming in July. It's a disability and dystopia anthology, and I just released my award-winning debut YA contemporary fantasy, Child of the Dragon, from Inked and Grey Press in March.
Awesome. We are publishing soon. So I have the short story in the Inked and Grey Press's next anthology. Yes. Pubsibs. Nice to have you, Ash. So excited. The last but definitely not least, Elle-Marie.
Hi, I'm Elle-Marie Wood. I'm a psychological horror author. I have my 22nd book came out 2 weeks ago, and I am the president of the Horror Writers Association.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so not a horror reader or watcher, but I know it's like it's every, fans are out there. I've got friends who love writing horror stories, and I always meet a lot of horror authors in WriteHive. So it's like, okay, I can, get the flashlight and start reading your works before I I'm the total chicken. So awesome. So excited again. So when I saw this panel title kind of coming up, I was definitely like jumping on, raising my hand to be the first moderator on it, because I love this concept of the unreliable narrator. It's one that I don't think I could ever write. And even when I think about trying to understand what an unreliable narrator is, which kind of leads me into our first questions, I really kind of have a hard time wrapping my head around it, because why would we want to have someone that we can't, like, why do you want to root for somebody that you're not sure if you're supposed to root for and what they are? So to start us off, I want you guys to kind of just give me, what are some great examples of stories with an unreliable narrator? So just to kind of set the tone for us, so maybe those who aren't familiar with the concept can visualize those stories and those pictures, and then we can start talking strategy. Ash, why don't you give me some of your examples?
Some of the ones that come to mind first, and I know they're kind of controversial examples, but Katniss in the Hunger Games and Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. I could talk more about why I think they're unreliable later, but I love them as examples. Other good examples are Pi Patel in Life of Pi. If you've read the book or seen the movie, you know the plot is very reliant on Pi being avoidant of the truth. And as a plug for my own character in my debut, Child of the Dragon, Coleman is one of 3 POV characters. And as you'll read, you notice that he kind of skirts around certain topics. And within his narrative, he doesn't really like to give straight answers. I mean, he's gay, so he doesn't really like to give straight anything, but that's another story. I like to say he flirts with the fourth wall a little bit. He never outright breaks it, but if you're paying attention, you can tell he's at least somewhat aware that there's an audience and he's trying to perform to them specifically. And he's just a really fun character. And so far, most people really like him. So he's one of my favorites.
And that's a hard one to think of examples. Like I felt completely put on the spot at the time. I wanted to listen to what you were saying, and I'm just like thinking, you know, to be honest, in psychological horror, everyone's an unreliable narrator because not on purpose. I mean, and that's the thing. That's the beauty of it. I think it's not necessarily a purposeful misguiding, but it is that the nature of what the character's experiencing. So if you think about, I don't know, I think of Carrie, for instance, in the book Carrie. I don't know that we should fully agree and understand and side with her plight entirely, but that's the nature of all humans, isn't it? I mean, not every person is not pure. No one is pure completely entirely. So we can't necessarily assume that everything they say and do next will be the correct move. But Carrie comes to mind. Jonathan Harker in Dracula comes to mind. I mean, once he meets the vampire, we have some challenging moments where we have to decide if we're going to believe him. And we're relying upon his letters to Mina, right? So a lot of different things there. Like in general, it's hard to pick out several examples because horror relies upon this so much because of the way that we're impacted by whatever is frightening us.
Absolutely. Some examples do come to my mind though. Recently I read The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim, and her narrator, Juwon, is very unreliable for various reasons, primarily hallucinations. Another one that I read recently is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. And there was a really good horror book called There Is No Anti-Memetics Division by Quantum, who this one is unique because the premise is that there are monsters that take away your memory and identity. So it's not necessarily that the narrators themselves are purposely avoiding something or purposely lying. It's that they literally cannot remember who they are or what their purpose is.
For frame narratives, which Ashley hinted at, I think Shadow of a Torturer by Jean Wolfe is one of the most, I will say, classic examples. It's a frame narrative, and we have the classic future character narrating the story from his youth, right? But throughout the book, several things happen that you find out during book 3 and 4 to more detail that truly affect what he knew or how he interpreted the events of the first book. So you get some comments that are somewhat foreshadowing, but at the same time, there is a purposeful obscuring of what he's narrating. Like he's choosing his words very carefully about what to reveal and what to say. Another example that I could give is The Affirmation by Christopher Priest. This is in an entirely different way. It's not a frame narrative. It's more biases of a character. So the biases of a character and how he sees the world affects what he believes is real, which is something entirely different because it's not a character that purposefully tries to manipulate the narrative. It's a character that cannot do anything. This is how he sees the world, and that's it, right? In a different case, and perhaps more on horror, which I read only very occasionally, Tender is a Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica has a very different type of unreliable narrator, which is, I will say, a narrator that somewhat knows he wants to be unreliable, but more for himself than for the reader, right? So again, it's a different type of unreliability. And then, for example, different books that have children narrators, they tend to be generally unreliable, not because they are ego, mostly because they have a limited knowledge of the world and they filter everything through that limited knowledge. So what you get is a story that is unreliable, right? For example, Totoro by Studio Ghibli, you could say it's unreliable because you don't know really if Totoro is real or if it is just an imagination from the little girls, right? So they appear in different ways depending on the genre, but I think as a general rule of thumb, the idea of an unreliable narrator is that you can't really believe everything they say, but it may not be just, because they don't want to share the story.
Awesome. That's such an interesting point, and it actually leads into the next question. That is, what does it mean for a narrator to be unreliable? Beautifully. So, Ange, I'm going to let you start on this one, and then see, kind of stemming off of these examples that you guys have given to us. What does it actually mean for the narrator to be unreliable?
Well, at the very basic level, an unreliable narrator is somebody who isn't entirely truthful. Either it's to the reader, as many of them are, it's to themselves, which is a really cool plot device, or a little bit more rarely, they're not truthful to other characters, but the reader knows.
I want to add something. I know it's become more popular in modern times, but it's actually a pretty old device. For what I found when I was doing some research, it comes from 1961. That's the first time it was defined as a narrator whose credibility is compromised. And I really like that because the fact that it's compromised implies so many things. It's not only somebody who purposefully does this, but could be, for example, just drunk. And if you are drunk and you are narrating, for example, in a first person narrator, a drunk narrator, maybe just temporarily unreliable and then come back to being perhaps more truthful or trying to be objective. But that said to me, I'm sorry. I just wanted to echo your words, Mary, because you said that we are all biased, that we all have some degree of unreliability, and I think that's entirely true.
Yeah, no, and I think you raised a wonderful point about how it could be temporary. I mean, being drunk, impaired in some way, extreme fear,
yes,
being in love,
anxiety,
the first stages of being in love. I mean, that's not a real state at all. I mean, just if we think about it, if we can look back on it, if we've ever been lucky enough to have felt that, there's so many things that are not realistic and won't track in the same way after you've been together 6 months, a year, whatever. But I would challenge that Gothic fiction, which is going to go back 200 years from where you just mentioned, Livia. Gothic fiction was dealing with unreliability before there was a name for it. So perhaps the 60s is when we came up with how to label this thing
with a name, exactly.
Right. But we definitely were doing that in Gothic. I mean, Anne Radcliffe, or just the Mysteries of Udolpho. Just read it.
I think a lot of
anything about the Gothic nature of any of the writing, the castles, the shadows, once you're afraid of something just once, the shadow one night, the next night you're going to go into that feeling fear about what could be coming. And so you're already now unreliable. Yeah. So I think that Gothic has done such a wonderful job with that. So yeah, I think the naming convention might have been the 60s, but it's definitely been something that's been out for a long, long time.
Well, that's the case of a lot of devices, right? We just put that the name like a decade or two ago.
We're always doing all of it, and until we, can label it, then it's like, oh, that's what I've been doing my entire life. I see. Right. Ash, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I was going to say that, I agree that because most narrators are not omnipotent, they're always going to be slightly unreliable because they don't know everything. But I think what makes an unreliable narrator stand out from just your run-of-the-mill normal narrator is that it takes it even further, and through the lens of the narrator, whether the narrator is doing it on purpose or if it's you as the author, as the director, shaping the view of the story through the lens of the narrator, we're keeping information from the audience. Sometimes this is maliciously, and sometimes it's innocently, and sometimes it's for a valiant purpose, sometimes it's out of fear, and there's lots of different reasons a character may or may not be reliable, and that doesn't mean that they are bad or good, and they can be in any genre, and I think that's really fun.
That really kind of leans in, right? We're just tying in. You guys are making the connections and transitions so easy for me today. Right? That ties into the next question of why would you actually want to make a narrator unreliable? Like you guys, I think Elmarie and Andrew said in horror, it's required that you have to kind of withhold things, and listening to it sounds like, I guess, in mystery you would also kind of have to withhold stuff. So why would you want to make a narrator unreliable? And Elmarie, I'm gonna have you start with this one.
Okay. I mean, I think that it's not necessarily, well, it's not only required, it's just the nature of human behavior. And so if you're writing, all stories, regardless of genre, are typically rooted in some factual space. And whatever, even if you're creating a world with a whole bunch of subsystems, you have to adhere to that space at some point. Whatever you've created, you want to try and work within those parameters. And horror is no different. In that, I mean, I personally write psychological horror, so I'm dealing a lot with the lived experience and the concerns of someone, what they're experiencing with their minds and their mind and their thoughts and whatever the emotions that go with it. But in any scenario, whether we're talking about that or some kaiju busting down all the buildings and running through, right? If you're not starting at some place where everyone can connect and find themselves, so that when the frightening thing happens, they can have a legitimate and authentic reaction. And that reaction may very well match some of the characters in the book. If you don't start there, then you're kind of starting, you're asking the reader to suspend disbelief right away. And that's really difficult to do. So because of that, what we typically do is you have a realistic situation, and then you apply whatever to it. It's like applying the sauce to, applying the salt to the water first, then boiling the pasta, making the sauce, and applying the ingredients to that sauce. That unreliable narrator is part of that mix because it has to be, because that's what the dish requires, if that makes any sense. So you can't really avoid it if you've layered the story properly. Someone's going to be saying something from their perspective, and that perspective is going to be completely off the mark. That makes them unreliable.
Livia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's I don't write psychological horror, but both my series have very thorough psychological elements. One it's a psychological fairy tale, and the other is weirdly genre blender psychological, and I will say eldritch horror as well. But I want to echo what Mary says, is that when you are writing humans, being unreliable or biased, which is one of the sources of unreliability, it's human nature, and it's not only about how they perceive the event. Like, for example, one of my characters is a strategist. He has PTSD, in particular with fire, due to what happened in his career. So at some point, he sees a flame in a lantern, and just like everything starts spiraling until he snaps and comes back. And it doesn't mean that that someone was screaming in the air, right? But I was appealing to the loss of dual perception and to other effects that a traumatic flashback can have. So is that just you have that temporal unreliability in there, but you also may have like all the baggage and how he perceives the flames and what he thinks of, for example, a siege that involves something like Greek fire, for example, right? So the unreliability, as I see it, extends more than just which events are presented, but which opinion the character may have about something, right? How do you interpret the events of the world? For example, a very religious character, which I have in my latest book, in Nikos, everything is like, oh, this is a message from the spirits. Oh, the spirits bless me. And, because that's how he sees the world. Like everything in his world is real. Does it truly mean that the spirits are real? Not really. It's psychological horror. Maybe misunderstanding something. But in another case, I have another character, a woman that's that she is far more analytical, and she's also a politician. So everything is relationships, debt, strategy, and so on, right? It doesn't mean that the world is just that it's that she reduces it to it, right? So to me, it's part of being human nature, how we perceive the world and the interests that we have, right? Because if, for example, if you're a painter and you really like painting, you're probably going to be walking on the street and looking at the shadows and the colors in a very different way, and your inner narrator will be in a very different style, right? So to me, unreliability is just it's just fundamental to try to convey true humans.
Awesome.
So I was going to say that obviously, like, to keep secrets is a big reason why you might want to use an unreliable narrator, but more specifically, having an unreliable narrator can help to build tension in the plot and to help slowly reveal what's happening over the course of the story. I will warn that you can't use it to keep everything from the audience. You have to make sure it makes sense for the character to beat around the bush or to have this gap in their knowledge. And you have to give the audience enough details from other parts of the story that the reader can start to see the shape of the information the narrator is leaving out. Make sure the reader can read between the lines, as it were. The readers can never, like, if the readers could never pick up on the fact that the narrator is leaving things out on purpose, or you as the author are leaving things out on purpose, it can feel sloppy or like a completely different story with a normally reliable narrator. So you have to be you have to walk that line really carefully to make sure that sometimes what the narrator is telling is going to have a discrepancy in what you're actually showing in the story. But I think it's a really great way to build tension and suspense.
And
I was going to say something very similar to what Livia said about how every character kind of views the world differently. And when you have an unreliable narrator, you get sort of it characterizes them, right? So I have a character, for instance, I write cosmic horror. So there's a lot of unreliability that comes with that just from the nature of the horror itself. And I have a character who's very analytical. She's a doctor and she's very logic minded. So when she encounters these cosmic events, like slowly over time, she tries to force her interpretation on them, her scientific interpretation, and you can see over the course of the book like her character development as a result of this original unreliability. So it's a really good tool for characterizing your characters, but also how they view the world. So you get to sort of interface with the world through their eyes because of it.
great. So it's clearly like it's a technique that we're going to use, and then you can find different ways that you guys want to use strategically, and you keep touching upon this notion of framing things. And so I come from a communication background, and I always use framing as a particular lecture where you have an exercise. If everyone's staring out the window, we all kind of hone in on different focal points, and we're all looking at the same image, but we pick up on things. So that sounds like a similar idea that you guys are each kind of picking up on, and that kind of ties in to the question of what types of stories would suit having an unreliable narrator, because our frame really kind of fits with our notions of genre. So it sounds like there are certain genres or certain types of stories that lend themselves more towards unreliable narrators than others. So kind of connected to that and piggybacking or doubling up, what types of unreliability might be connected to those types of stories? So two-pronged question there. Ash, why don't I start with you?
Sure. So what types of stories will suit an unreliable narrator?
Yes.
First of all, I think unreliable narrators can be in any genre. I said this a little bit already, but
Yep.
it is important to note that it is often perceived as a negative thing. That or not like that the characters are often more morally gray or like anti-heroes, but I don't think it has to be. It can be a story about a character learning to accept themselves. It can be about a character who's trying to somehow protect the audience. And sometimes they're unreliable because they themselves are scared of the truth. And so that leads into the types of different unreliability is I think there are the narrators who are doing it intentionally. They're trying to be misleading and dishonest. Maybe they don't want to reveal that they killed their mom. Maybe they want to paint themselves as the hero. Then there are ones who are unreliable because they're unwilling to face something. So maybe they didn't kill their mom, but they don't want to talk about the fact their mom's dead. And they're going to skirt around the bush on that. There's the ones who are unreliable because they assume everyone else is also unreliable. This is kind of the Katniss Everdeen sort of one. She's relatively certain everyone is also scheming and they're scheming against her, and she's this irredeemable person. So whether she's doing it on purpose or not, her narrative is marred by this inherent suspicion and guilt that isn't actually how her allies think or feel about her, but we have to use other character cues to pick up on how she's actually being perceived. Then there are the ones who are unreliable because they don't understand what's going on. There has to be enough context clues to show to the audience that the character doesn't understand things. Sometimes this is because the character is a child. You might find this also in disabled characters, and I think I'd personally discourage that kind of use as it can become ableist and sanist really, really quickly. And so it would just recommend not demonizing disabilities, but that is another ways that the narrator themselves just don't know what's happening. There are the narrators that have such intense biases or preconceived notions about the rest of the cast that will color the entire narrative. Also be careful with this one to avoid harmful stereotypes. And then there's the Bilbo Baggins type that they think it just makes a better story or casts them in a better light, or it just makes it a little bit more interesting. So like with the ring, of course he won the ring. Like he didn't trick Gollum. Gollum gave it to him. And then that got retconned after the Hobbit, like the first printing of the Hobbit to make way for the Lord of the Rings. But I believe Tolkien himself has even said that Bilbo was rather unreliable and took some narrative liberties to make the story a little bit more interesting. So those are the main types, in my opinion.
Ange?
Yeah, I generally agree with that list. I would also add like trauma, it could be a survival mechanism. Also like physical illness, not necessarily disability or anything like that, but like brain tumors, for instance, can cause, hallucinations and figments of the imagination or other, mental illnesses perhaps. Misunderstandings, very simple misunderstandings could cause a person or character to become an unreliable narrator because they made assumptions about something that happened to another character or an event, and then they act on that, and things unfold from there. So yeah, I mean, Ash's list was very, very, very good already.
Well, I agree with Ashley with the idea that any genre can have an unreliable narrator. To me, determining whether to use one, it's not about the character, but how you choose to handle the narrator. So let me put it up this way. If you have the character, your narrative is like a camera that follows that character, right? So the closer that you put up that camera to the character, the more you will need to be unreliable. Now, the types of and the degree of unreliability can change, but it doesn't change the fact that you are closer to their biases, to their problems, to their health issues, to how they see their world, or farther away. So, for example, Dune is not precisely head hoping, it's more like an omniscient narrator. So you only see things temporarily, but because the narrator is changing, you never get into perceiving pain in a very unique and single-minded point of view for that specific character. Now, if you want change in another grim manner. For example, Glocktoff, A First Law by Joe Abercrombie. He's disabled and he has a lot of scenes and he's just like walking around cursing whoever created the stairs because the stairs are painful to walk in, and that changes, but that is because, again, that camera is closer to the narrative. It doesn't mean that you will only do unreliable narrators on first person, right? A third-person narrative can also be incredibly close to that character and still have that influence of the unreliability, right? So, for example, I think Shilling in the Stormlight Archive is a great example of an unreliable narrator that still uses third person because you have the camera very close to the narrator, to the character that you are following, right? So, and then, of course, I will say that the unreliability is a type of lens that you have, right? And how they see the world. But to me, more than the genre or the character style, to me is that distance And I go back again to what Mary said before. It's because to me, unreliability is human. So there is always going to be one moment in time in which you will have an unreliability in the character perception of a world.
Every character, to piggyback on what Livia was just saying, every character. So if that's the case, my perspective is that every story in any genre whatsoever can utilize an unreliable character properly. I think we've touched upon all the big reasons. I mean, Ashley's list was wonderful. And all of the smaller reasons we've talked about in other questions, they all apply. If I live on one street, I know what's happening on my street. Technically, I really only know what's happening between my house, the house in front of me, and maybe on the side, whatever I can see visibly. Not necessarily up and around the corner. So if you tell me that something blew up 2 streets away, from my perspective, nothing happened. And that's unreliable. Something blew up. There's a crater in the ground, but I didn't see it. I'm over here. So therefore, anything that I might tell you about that day or write about that day and anything that goes on, if that's part of the story, it's not right. It's not true. That's not accurate, which makes me unreliable. And I think that in any case, especially when you're having it switch between characters during the course of a story, anyone can do it. Any story can handle it.
Awesome. So then that ties into the next question is like, what are the different types of ways that a narrator, or here it seems like more broadly, any character becomes unreliable? So Elmarie, do you want to kind of extend on this notion that ways that they can be unreliable?
Anything. I mean, circumstance, access. So in this example I just gave you, I can't see beyond my window and beyond the house. I can't see the house behind that house in front of me. So if that's the street that something happened on, I didn't see it, didn't hear it, didn't feel it. I don't know it. So it's not my reality. So that same minute will be discussed in different ways. If we just take the 1 minute interval, someone who's sick in their house in that same minute, doesn't matter if they are right in front of the thing blowing up, they are thinking only of their illness or their child's illness or the animal's illness. And so that's their reality. If that person is drunk, they are oblivious. If the person is not home because they are on travel, they don't know their house is empty. So in that minute, they're in another part of the world. So every individual can only narrate their own circumstance, which makes them unreliable for every other circumstance in the world. Even within a relationship, I can only talk about my side of the relationship, not accurately about the other side of the relationship. So it's unfortunate because the answer sounds really nebulous when you talk about it like that, but that is also the beauty of it. You have such flexibility to utilize this as a plot device because no one is reliable. Really, that's what we should be talking about. The obscurity of the reliable narrator. There is no reliable narrator. Everyone is unreliable. At this moment, we're on this panel. I have a house full of people here. I don't know what they're doing. I have no idea what could be happening elsewhere. And in such case, if someone were to ask me what happened in your house at X time, I'm going to answer that I was on a panel. I don't have an answer. And that makes me unreliable for the events that could be very, very important to the story that's being crafted. So I hope that helps because the answer to me should be less granular because we need to embrace how big it can be.
Right. And because you can also build on maybe like adding ways that you could implement unreliability or techniques. So in addition to those ways.
Oh, techniques.
As a broader way.
Yeah, I mean, Elmarie gave such a great answer. I don't think I can add to that. But in terms of techniques, I implement this in this novella that I'm currently writing where the main character is dead. It's not a spoiler. And she skirts around the topic of her murder. Like she'll describe things that might have happened, but she avoids the word entirely. She doesn't she does this because she doesn't want to think of it as her murder. She wants to pin a more positive light on it because she's a vampire. So and so I purposely have her avoid saying what it is as what it is, right? So it's like a dance around the topic, and it could be any situation, right? It could be a falling out with a romantic partner. It could be the death of a parent. It could be any traumatic events or just something that a character doesn't want to confront. And so being able to describe or talk around the event, the catalyst, is one technique you could use. That's off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Ash, do you want to add? Any different ways narrators can be unreliable or ways to implement unreliability?
Yeah, I really like what Marie was saying about like how like those secondhand accounts are always going to be a little unreliable, and like characters who are missing information because of they were not being able to perceive the event as it happened. I'm sitting here like, man, do I have a lot more like unreliable narrators than I thought I did? One of the other point of view characters in Child of the Dragon is he's human and he has no idea what's going on. But all he knows is that his best friend is acting real weird since her grandma died, and he's trying to like piece things together and is not coming to the right conclusion because he's not going to be in the right mind of thinking, oh yeah, of course she's turned into a dragon. Like, but like he's trying to pick things apart and is noticing that something is wrong, but he's never going to come to the correct conclusion on his own. And then like also Ange was saying with when they skirt around the topic, I'm not going to give spoilers for what the character I think of as my unreliable narrator, Coleman. He has a few things in his past that he doesn't broach directly, but he'll use very specific language around the topics that you don't like, that he doesn't want to talk about, and he kind of like and he gets really, really close to saying it outright, but then just kind of just scoots around it, just like I'm just going to acknowledge it and then pretend I didn't. And so you'll see that a lot. I mean, like it really like blunt example that you probably would want to make more subtle, but you could have like a character who's like, oh, and this morning I had I had breakfast with my mother, and then like in the next scene, the character like some character's talking to someone and it's like, oh, I'm so sorry for the passing of your mother last week, and then you're like, oh wow, there's a discrepancy between what I'm being told and what I'm being shown, and like that I think those are like you start to be able to shape the story around what the character doesn't want to talk about.
Livia?
Yeah, sure. So if you allow me, I'm going to focus a bit more on the implementation. I think that will answer, at least from my point of view, how the different types of unreliability. So to me, it's always how you write the voice of the character, that camera that I said. For example, if you have a child narrating, especially if you have a younger child, like 7, 8 years old, the child could say, Papa is sad, right? He's downcast, he's so blue, he's doing this and that. And through those clues, an adult reader should be able to figure out that something is happening, especially if before you change to the father in that narrative and the father told you their problems, right? So in that way, I will say, leveraging knowledge that the reader may have either from the real world or through common sense and may be able to infer from the narrative. That's one of the key elements. One of the examples that I really like is A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a post-apocalyptic fiction. But what I really like of that one, it's organized in 3 parts, and each one is 600 years apart. So the second part will tell you some myths and legends from events that you actually saw in the first part. So you are reading it and you are like, that's not how it happened. You actually follow the character, right? But history and time and, a lack of proper writing and passing of the stories affected the narrative. You can do that in multiple ways. For example, the Book of a New Sun by Gene Wolfe is also a post-apocalyptic science fiction story, which is actually set in the real world, millions or perhaps thousands of years in the future. And there is a point in which the main character describes a photo of an astronaut in the moon, but he does so limiting the language. He describes an armor, a helmet of gold, right? A spear rather than different things, because he was using language in a very specific way. But if you pick up all the elements, the reader is able to infer that, right? And in that case, it's simply because it's a linguistic problem. The character didn't have the language to be specific, right? Another case will be, for example, intoxicated characters. And the example that I have for that is A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. You want to make it obvious that the story is about people, methamphetamine drug addicts. And sometimes there is a character talking and the police officer turns into a cockroach and starts growing antennae, and it's silly, but the character is high, right? So in that case, the contrast between what seems reasonable for it to happen versus what's not reasonable will give you the unreliability, right? Another case could be, for example, contradicting events. Like I said before, suppose that you have three characters. This one thinks the second one was actually angry. The third one thinks the second character was sad or perhaps offended, right? So that change in perception is what, from those, the reader has to pick up the truth, right? Each of them is right, because I will argue that truth is relative to the observer, right? So in that case, from all of that, the reader has to make up a picture. And was that second character angry or sad? Who knows? Infer. And that's also something somewhat uncomfortable for the reader, but unreliable narrators make that. Another case will be, for example, situations of extreme adrenaline. In The Weight of the World, The Weight of the Earth, The Weight of the World by T.R. Napper, he has a character who is a police officer doing a ride. And during that ride, the narrator basically clips the narrative. He says, hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, a hand on my shoulder, left, wall, and start describing things. There are no verbs, there are no nouns, nothing, but it makes sense. It's a classic scene of a guy with a gun going and checking everything. You don't have time to think, right? So the narrative shrinks and you clip up the words that are not really needed, like verbs or articles you don't make pure grammatically correct sentences. You just make what you can. And that will affect, for example, cases of being afraid or being in pain. Probably if you have been in pain, you know that you can't be really clear. Sometimes you can just talk when you are in pain, right? So that also translates to the narrative. And then I think there are things that you can do in a more literary way. For example, things that I have done in particular, I have changed verbal tenses when a character has a PTSD flashback. Or you can, another one that I did, I literally strike through text in one of my stories in Dance With Me to somewhat showcase the denial of a character. So they will have the thought, but they will deny it and then have the other thing, right? The corrected idea, right? So it really depends on also the genre that you are working, because, for example, a children's story, you can't go very literary with that. You have to do something more accessible for the public that you are writing for.
Yes, definitely. I write middle grade fiction, so the book over here is a middle grade fantasy. So, but I also love multiple point of views. So this idea that when you have multiple POVs, you really kind of shift who's reliable and whose story are you leaning into at that moment. So this idea that we can shift through it, and then dealing with the challenge of writing to a younger audience can definitely be something. I have my unreliable quote unquote narrator, based on the definitions you give, would be my villains, right? Where I don't know, you have a very obvious villain through the whole book, but there's actually a hidden villain throughout. So their interactions are very unreliable. That sounds like you got to wrap your head around it. And for kids to wrap around their heads around it can be a challenge. So next question that I'm posing to the panel was, is, how does an unreliable narrator affect the POV of your particular stories, right? So Ange, I'm going to start with you here.
Well, I mean, going back to what Livia said about the close camera, right? The POV, the closer you are, to the character, then the more of that unreliability will affect the storytelling. So, and it, obviously you have first person POV, which is right there, and then you have third person at varying degrees. It can be very close that almost mimics first, and so you really get that immersive experience. But even at like middle distance, you can still have the unreliability affect it. My book, The Devouring, is written in that sort of middle third person distance. But even so, like when I am writing chapters, or when you're reading the chapters for this one of the characters, he has antisocial personality disorder. So his view of the world is colored by that. And so I never use terms like he doesn't know things. I never use the phrasing that he doesn't understand something. There's actually a line that I specifically purposely wrote where he's listening or he's eavesdropping on this conversation. Normally, I would say in a language he doesn't understand, but I wrote it as in a language he hasn't learned yet because he doesn't have that concept of not understanding something. And so, like, you can really play around with that depending on like the closeness of the camera. And it's kind of get into the character's head in certain ways.
I really don't know that there's a whole lot to be honest. I think that was as comprehensive as I would have been with it as well. I think that was great. I don't think that there's I just think that there's so much that you can do in this case with what we're talking about, that you can't, that POV in and of itself being fluid. Well, I write typically in third person. I think I've only done first person a handful of times. I don't know. I think it's a product of when I started writing with a focus, because I started really young, but with a focus. It was in middle school and high school. And at that point, third person was kind of the thing, right? So I think that POV is something that you can, head hopping is a problem, but head hopping is not a problem. If that makes any sense, you have to be very crafty in the way that you handle head hopping. And then the term head hopping is an unfair assessment of someone's change in POV unless it was sloppy. I just have to be clear about that, because I think that sometimes we look at things and we're too rigid on some of our definitions, but then not strong enough in the writing to carry it forward, if that makes any sense. So first, we have to master this head hopping thing, having multiple POVs and managing them and keeping it clean. Once you do that, though, I think the unreliability is inevitable, because I think that everyone is unreliable. So for me, it's just part of the story. It's part of the way that it goes. See, that's why I was saying, I think your answer was so comprehensive that I didn't need to add to that. But now that I have, that's what I'm saying. Focus on the craft of writing multiple POVs before you worry about the unreliability, because the unreliability will happen as your story stretches out.
Great. Livia, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. So your question was, how does an unreliable narrator affect the POV? And for me, the answer to that is the information that gets communicated, right? And that can be not only about the narrative or the events that are happening, but with that example of the camera that I gave, like it's the lens, the color that you put up for the character and when they choose to communicate. For example, in The Omens of War, that story, it's a military setting, and because it has a cosmic horror element, I also have the POVs of the eldritch beings, right? One of these eldritch beings is 200,000 years old. Like, they are completely above morality. It's just like, I'm going to kill sources, humans. That's okay. It's a purpose for a study. It doesn't really have an ethical quality. They don't think about it. They don't have that assessment, because it's simply something that with that lifespan doesn't compete them, right? Now there are also a narrator that is a human, that is a strategist, a leader. They will, of course, care about how many troops they sacrifice and the objectives that they get, right? So that type of information, what you communicate, and it can be something more, I would say, mundane rather than that. For example, if a character chooses to always describe whether there are books in a room, before, or they choose to describe the room first before the people, or they choose to describe clothing rather than the faces of the people. That probably builds up the character, their interests, right? For example, you have an architect that is a narrator. The architect will probably not even see the people. They will start looking at the paintings, the windows, the styles, So to me, it's basically not only about the event, but the presentation of the event throughout the story.
Ash, you want to add?
I think we've covered it. That depending on how close you are is going to be. I mean, they're going to be written like any other narrator, but maybe just slightly to the left as they're avoidant or redirect, or maybe you just clearly don't understand something that's happening. But I think I might want to add is that because all narrators are going to be at least a little unreliable, intentionally or not. Sometimes readers may not even agree that a narrator is or is not intentionally reliable. Some may not fully pick up on you trying to make it intentional. They may not notice the discrepancies in the showing versus telling. They may assume a character was intentionally unreliable when they were just normal level unreliable. And I think that's just something to be aware of as um, the unreliable narrator is shaping the way the reader is perceiving the story, and they may or may not notice that they are affecting the camera angles. So I think I'll just add that sometimes readers will interpret it differently than what you think they're going to interpret it as, just because they're perceiving it in their own way too, on top of the way that you have written it. So
we just added like layer after layer after layer. So everybody has their own perception. Everybody has their own frame. And so
the perception
the idea that
lasagna.
we're like looking at it through our camera, and it's just like this big unreliable. Who knows what's in between all those little layers, and who's going to interpret it? Awesome. Well, it leads us to our final question for this particular panel is, how do each of you use an unreliable narrator to enhance your own stories? And like maybe what advice, if you wanted to suggest others to try to incorporate these themes in, how is it that you individually use the unreliable narrators to enhance your stories? So Marie, I'm going to catch you before you let you
Well, I appreciate that. Because it depends upon the genre, right? For psychological horror, and let me not say that only for the way that I write psychological horror. So what I do with my work is that I'm writing the lived experience. So every single scenario that happens, to kick off a book, to end a book, whatever, is coming from the experience of the person who is living and watching and being impacted by whatever's going on. So in that natural reaction that someone may have to something that's happened, there's going to be that unreliability as we've discussed throughout. So my advice is to just let it happen. I try not to force an unreliable narrator because people are going to do it anyway, and it'll just happen. It'll be in the sauce, like I mentioned earlier. So I don't force it. I just let it happen. Let me give you the caveat, though. I am a pantser, so I let a lot of stuff happen. I write when I want to write. I do not outline. Okay, I'm very loosey goosey.
Unreliable.
I am unreliable. That's my label. My middle name is unreliable. So anyway, but I mean, I just literally, I let things manifest as they will. But in doing so, not only am I extremely excited to write the work and see what's going to happen, because I'm finding out as I go, the characters' reactions are organic. It's like this is what someone would say if they stubbed their toe, so they would have this moment, and you have whatever happens thereafter. They stub their toe, they fall down, they whatever, and someone upstairs. How many times have you ever been in a house where people are there and you hear a thump? From your perspective, it sounds like they dropped the television on the floor, right? But someone really just like bumped their knee against something. It was nothing's broken, but in your perspective, you're yelling from downstairs, "What happened?" And nothing happened. They just knocked into something. That's the thing, that if you're a horror author, there's a monster in the house. Or you see what I mean? There's something you can inject anything. If you're a mystery, a thriller author, someone just got kidnapped. The window being burst open and someone being. So you can interject any element that you want as long as you allow it to flow, allow the characters to react, and they will become unreliable on their own. Just don't restrict how unreliable they are, because when you let people react the way they're going to react, and in real life scenarios, when you have this happen, there's magic, and I think that you just have to go ahead and watch it. I believe that as authors, we capture and record the magic. And if you just let it happen as it is, you will find these wonderful gems that you didn't have to massage at all.
Ash?
I personally like to use unreliability as a way to build suspense and character growth and to have really great plot twists and like reveals. I think it can be a really fun way to like build up towards that, and like it can work into the foreshadowing, it can work into everything that like has everything come together in a nice puzzle piece of a reveal at the end. I am going to just reiterate again that you do have to be careful to make sure to cue the readers in kind of early on that the narrator may not be 100% accurate or truthful, so that way they don't get sucker punched by the reveal. Like you want them to be a little sucker punched, you want them to be shocked, but like not like that they came out of nowhere. Otherwise, they might feel really unsatisfied with the story. And you have to be careful not to make sure everything is a lie, or again, it's going to turn into a different story than the one you set out to write. And the lie should be a tasteful garnish rather than the main dish. It's part of the sauce. It's an ingredient. It's not the main dish. So yeah, I think it's just a way to enhance the story, really. I think it's fun.
So I love characters who lie a lot. So my stories are full of liars. Um, but in my case, as I mentioned in my introduction, that I really like to write morally questionable characters, characters who are selfish, who have these motivations that are not, good all the time or ever. My book, both of the POV characters are unreliable in the sense that they are majorly huge liars. Um, and so the reader actually knows what's going on, but it's the other characters that's how the main narrators shape the narrative around themselves to the other characters in the book. That is the unreliability. And so for me, I like to explore that kind of like moral nuance basically, and how different people lie to other people or lie to themselves and that sort of thing. So that's how I like to do it personally.
Livia?
Yeah. So to me, I mostly write in very, very close narrators. Either one series is first person, Dance with Me, and the other series is third person. But to me, the narrative, it shows the character's worldview. So I write very, very close, and that means that the psychology of the characters is to me fundamental, and the unreliability is a way to convey that. I did it in very different ways. I will say that one is more introspective and the other is more caused by the world. So, for example, on this one in particular, and That's With Me, it's a story about surviving emotional abuse, right? It's the main character goes through a lot of things. It's told through an allegory. So the character is actually a ceramic ballerina, and she has an elven owner. So there is a power difference in size as well. But the way she chooses to think, like, for example, he shows stressed, he shows angry, and trying not to communicate a specific words or trying not to see herself in as the damage happens, and that means that her ceramic cracks. I chose to do it that way to keep it clean, not to be morbid about the situation, but also because I generally want to be truthful to the experience. I don't care so much about legibility or hand-holding the reader. I want them to experience what it feels like, right? So, for example, in this case, I have that. And yeah, some readers will pick it up, some others will not, but that's an authorial choice, right? In the other series, they characters mostly have PTSD or CPTSD. Most are veterans. Some of them have a very terrible childhood. That's the Omens of War. Both characters have those situations. So to me, it's mostly again, the psychological aspect is fundamental. If I choose to have a scene that is the way I organize it is generally this. I will have the flashback or the traumatic event or something that triggers a character. And then I will have some smaller clues or something about the character trying to rationalize it, right? And that's all the help that I will give, right? But again, that's a choice. Some writers may prefer to be very legible about what's happening and have, for example, another character label the symptoms of the first one. I rather don't do that, especially because the world that I'm writing on, they don't really have that type of medicine, right? So I can do that. The Eldritch beings know that, and so one of the groups of Eldritch beings, let us say that they are based on psychology. They can actually understand human emotions, or that's the element that they research. But they will use alternative wording. For example, one premise of the books is that thoughts and emotions are atemporal, right? Because the panic that you had in the past can be felt again in the present. But I'm trying to actively leave the reader to pick that up, right? It adds a layer of complexity. So to me, it's always a balance of how truthful do I want to be, or how truthful to reality versus how much do I want to balance the legibility, right? Depending on where I'm at on the story, very early or very late at it, I may choose differently, because I'm guessing that if you are in the last quarter of a 500 pages book, you probably understand everything right now, or the style, right? But if I'm introducing you, that's different. For example, the Echoes of Yore follows, that's my latest release. It follows 3 characters with dissociative flashbacks. That means that I'm constantly teasing what is real and what was real, but may not be real now. So sometimes the characters may ask themselves, like, what is real? Or they may try to do something to assert the truthfulness of the reality, right? But that's as much as I will go. And I think that's something to take into account when writing unreliable narrators, is that not every reader likes them. Not every reader is comfortable with them. And that also means that there is a layer of, effort the reader has to put in to piece out how much of what you are writing or communicating is real or not. Some readers do not like it and will just DNF, right? And that's okay. Different styles, right? But there are others that have tolerance levels, and that's where understanding your audience, the type of story that you are writing comes in. I would hazard to say that psychological horror readers may be far more tolerant to unreliability than, for example, for a middle grade story, right?
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Middle grade, we have to spell everything out for them. And so it's a challenge to find that balance where I'm trying to build the inferences in, and your editors come back and say, no, these are kids. You got to tell it like it is. They need to go in this direction and explicitly say it. But yes, awesome. This has been an absolutely incredible panel. I love the discussion on it. So before we kind of wrap it up, I want to give you guys an opportunity to let us know and let the watchers know, where can we find you? What projects do you have coming up? Any kind of plugs you want to do? So I'm just going to go again counterclockwise. Ash, I'm going to start with you.
You can find me, I'm mostly on Instagram, but you can find me on Threads and Blue Sky as @AshInTheAshes. And if you are on Tumblr, I'm there as Chronically Dragons. And you can follow me at any of those places. Again, I have my debut just came out, Child of the Dragon. You can get it anywhere online, or directly through Inked and Gray Press. You've wrapped really pretty if you get it through them. And then Artifice and Access you can also get online wherever books are sold. And at the time of recording, the title and the release date and the cover have not been announced for the Disability and Dystopia anthology, but I believe it's supposed to come out in July because it's Disability Pride Month. So during the panel, I should have more detail and I can drop it in the chat if anyone's interested in that one. And And then, yeah, I'm just working on the next thing all the time. But yeah, definitely come follow me wherever you use social media. Let's connect.
Awesome. And
So you can find me on my website at amshilling.com. I'm also very active on Blue Sky and Instagram. Both of my socials are linked on my website, so you can go there. You can buy my debut novel, The Devouring, at basically most major bookstores online, or order from your local library. And so we're in July right now, so I'm currently trying to draft a like a science fantasy sort of cyberpunk-ish novel as my next big book. But we'll see how that goes.
awesome. Livia?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me. It was a very interesting panel. And yeah, I enjoyed talking to all of you. So you can find me on liviajelliot.com. That's also my nickname on every social, Twitter, Threads, Instagram, and even on TikTok. I'm not the most active to comment. Sometimes it may take me a couple days to get into socials, but I generally try to answer everything. And all my books release wide. I have the two different series. That means that they are even on libraries. The Genesis of Change and Dance With Me, they are also an audiobook. And the narrator of Dance With Me, she's excellent. So if you prefer audiobooks, get the audiobook, I will say. And that said, you can also find my podcast on booksanddan.com. It's a newsletter. I write a very in-depth analysis. I teach about the writing craft. Unreliable narrators are something that I really like, so there is a lot of content about them. And yeah, you can sign up. I write weekly, so in there. And it goes straight to your email. That will be booksanddan.com. So thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, that is our time for this panel. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And for everybody else, make sure to check out all of the other events that are happening. And hopefully, any additional questions, all the socials will be dropped into the Discord chat. So make sure to copy them and follow and support all of these amazing, amazing authors. All right, you guys, thanks so much. That is it for us. Enjoy the rest of the con.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.